Welcome back to a YouTube exclusive. Today we have 10 tips and tricks for Marvel Snap that may not seem that intuitive, but they work. I have hit infinite on multiple accounts on my full collection Pool 3 account, on my free-to-play Pool 1 and Pool 2 account, so we know for sure that these are going to work. I have put in the effort, put in the work, and we have developed these tips and tricks that you may not come across in other videos, so hopefully these help you out. Let's get into it. Number 1, don't worry about playing on curve. A lot of people want to just play out the card that matches their energy. They want to put Quicksilver and Domino in their deck just to draw those cards, play them out on curve, turn 1, turn 2. But actually, playing cards on turn 1 and turn 2 is not that important, and sometimes it's just straight up wrong. Sometimes you take initiative by playing cards out. Sometimes you don't want initiative when you're going into turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6 especially. But make sure that you're doing what is best for your game plan, which a lot of times is not dropping a card on turn 1. Make sure that you are playing cards that fit your synergy, that fit the location that you want to be playing into. Sometimes you can't play a 5-drop into a location that you need to build up more power on, so you're going to have to drop a lower cost card just because of how the location works. So make sure that you are paying attention to that. And also when deck building comes around, don't put Quicksilver in your deck. You don't need to purposefully draw a bad card and play it on turn 1. It is better to put in better cards that you might have a chance at drawing rather than forcing yourself to draw a bad card. With that comes our next tip. Don't worry about being behind. Don't play for tempo. This game is not the same as other card games. You don't have to build up a huge board. There is a set number of turns, so with that, there's a set number of locations. You can wait to play out and fill up locations, and it's usually better actually because when you play from behind, you can also make sure that your opponent has the initiative to go first, and then when they go first, they can't counter your plays after you played them, and you also get a chance to counter their plays. Next up, number 3. Don't be afraid to completely abandon a location. In this game, you are only playing for 2 out of 3 locations, which means that you can completely abandon one and still win the game. So if your opponent is dumping a lot of resources into one location, don't be afraid to just give it up. Let them use their resources there. They will not be able to catch up to you if you spread out your power amongst the other 2 locations, and you will probably take that game down. Next up, number 4, plan your turns. This is a set number of turns game. There are 6 turns. So by turns 3 and 4, you should have most of your cards in your hand they're going to have for the whole game. All the locations will be revealed. You can plan out your turns 4, 5, and 6. On turn 4, definitely your 5 and 6, what you're expecting to do. That's not to say that you're always going to do it, but having that in mind allows you to know what you should be playing on 4, what you should be playing on 5 to prep your final turns. That way you're not necessarily wasting any cards or energy that you couldn't play out because you didn't plan out your turns enough. If you're playing a certain deck that has a certain win condition, you want to make sure that you're playing into that win condition, such as building up an Odin lane, setting up a death reduction so you can play death out on the final turn, different things like that. You want to make sure that you're planning that out in advance so that when you come to your final turn, you can get your entire game plan out. Next up, number 5, don't retreat sometimes. A lot of people will give you the opposite advice, I think, in a lot of other tips for Marvel Snap. They say, make sure you're retreating enough, don't stay in all the time. With that, I would say some people I see when I'm watching newer players, they retreat way too often. They're seeing final turns, their opponent snaps, or they're just on the final turn and no one snapped and they start like, oh man, I don't think I can win. My opponent could be ahead. You have to think about a lot of times, your opponent's not always going to have the nuts. Your opponent's not always going to have everything. They're not going to be able to always beat you. So you have to take into account the probabilities as well, the expected value. If you see that they put down their entire hand on turn 5, and then they have to top deck a card and play that out, a lot of times they have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the card that they actually wanted for that last turn, and you can still win the game with a very small margin. So sometimes it's worth staying in. Sometimes it's worth snapping your opponent back and staying in. Sometimes you have no winning play guaranteed, but if you have a winning play in your deck that your opponent doesn't know that you have, but they think you might have it, snap them back. A lot of times you'll get your opponent to retreat. you can use that to your advantage. Next up, number 6, everything is about turn 6 in this game, which also means that deck building and everything else is also about turn 6. So you having a deck that has a big surprise turn 6 will net you more cubes. That is one thing that's a little bit different about this game that cubes are affecting, is the deck building. So surprises actually matter. If you can hold your resources to turn 6, that will let you win big, which will take the control of the game again, which will kill your opponent's stuff, which will give you a big power spike, and your opponent doesn't see it coming, you will win more cubes. Your opponent may snap, you can snap back, they will not retreat because you have held your tech cards, you have held your biggest plays for the last turn, and you can use that to your advantage. Next up, tip number 7. I know this may sound like homework, but go ahead. There are websites out there you can do this on. Just practice some basic mental math. It actually really helps if you want to optimize your gameplay, if you want to be quicker at calculating who's winning a location, if you'd be winning a location, doing the probabilities after your opponent has played out a couple different lines, and doing all the math for all those to check if you can win. If you can do all this mental math quickly, you're going to be a lot better suited for actually knowing if you should stay in or retreat. So I would say if you're not that great at mental math, practice it a bit, check it out, and then maybe come back to the game. And you'd actually see, I think, a lot of improvement. I think one of the things that I've always been good at is just that mental math. So it really helps calculate really quickly at the end of games if I'm going to win. Next up, tip number 8, recognize your opponent's game plan. A lot of times there are going to be tells that you'll see what your opponent wants to be doing. And when you see that, you want to make sure that you recognize it and you account for it in the future turns. So if you see Yondu come out on the first couple of turns, you can bet that your opponent has a death in their deck. So if they play Wave on turn 5, you should definitely account for a death and another card coming out on the next turn. If you see a Khazar come out and you are running Killmonger, you will want to hold on to the Killmonger for as long as possible, unless they've already filled out their entire board with 1-drops. But if you see like 1 or 2 1-drops out there and they play the Khazar out there, you can bet that more 1-drops are going to be coming out. So you're probably going to want to try and give your opponent initiative, wait till turn 6, play the Killmonger for a big play. You'll win 8 cubes, trust me. And next up, we have maybe the most toxic trick in this video, waiting until your turn is almost over before you snap. This is used to not give your opponent information. Snapping is information. It lets your opponent know that you're confident, that you have a surprise play coming, something like that. So if you are doing a surprise play, like playing a Professor X, playing a Goblin, something that you don't want your opponent to change what they've already done, you can wait until the turn is almost over, and more likely than not, your opponent will have already ended their turn and they will be locked out of changing their play. I do actually hope that Second Dinner will change this in the future so that if you snap, if you've already ended your turn, it'll unlock your turn, because I do think that this is a little bit toxic to do, but it is a trick that could work to help help you in games, not have your opponent change their moves after you've snapped. But ideally, we shouldn't be waiting and roping out our opponents. It'd be nice if they made this change so that snapping unlocks your turn again for those 30 seconds that you have to make that decision. And last but not least, number 10, use locations that you wouldn't normally want to play on to your advantage. So there are locations like Superflow, Death's Domain, that you're typically not going to want to play onto. These cards give you, the Superflow gives you an advantage for not playing onto it. Death's Domain kills all your cards you play onto it, so you're not going to want to play onto it. So if you have a card like Professor X in your deck, you can play that onto Death's Domain, Superflow, when your opponent doesn't expect it, and it'll lock down that lane and you'll just win it. Death's Domain, you can also just play like an Armor on the last turn or any other card that changes the location, and then potentially win that. So you don't only have to use cards that could get into those kind of lanes through other means. You can play onto them with cards that allow you to stay there or change location altogether. But yeah, if you guys like this video, make sure you like and subscribe. Thank you guys again. We'll be back with more videos in the future. Check them out. Thank you. See you later.